Good morning, everyone. Once again, I'm honored to be introducing our next speaker in this second round of conferences for giftedness. Our speaker is Gretel Hernandez, holds a degree in psychology for the College of Psychologists in the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina. She is a university expert in assisting kids and teenagers, gifted kids and teenagers. She is part of the directory for supporting emotional needs of the gifted in the US, and she's mom to gifted kids. Together with Nicolas Ayala, they have a space. I'm gifted. This is your place. This is your haven. The presentation she's going to bring us is Embracing My Gifted Self, the odyssey of rediscovering yourself during the young adulthood. I'm sure that all the information she will share will be very interesting for all of you. Very warm welcome. Hello, I'm Gretel Hernandez. I hold a degree in psychology, member of the space. I'm gifted. This is your haven in Argentina. I want to thank the annual association and especially Lolly's help for this presentation that I've called Embracing My Gifted Self, the odyssey of rediscovering myself during my young adulthood. I'm going to base this presentation with my own experience with young people who go from the 21 to 30 years old, as well as some other studies with psychotherapy with gifted adults. My intention is to reach out to the young people who suspect or that they are gifted or who are in the process of being diagnosed. I would also like to help those experts that are accompanying these people in their own path. Also, the teachers, mentors that very often interact with them in study areas, and to any member of society that can help for positive change in this population. We can compare this process of identifying ourselves as a witness, myself, or any other expert that is accompanying this process. And we can compare it with the Odyssey from Ulysses, because there is a point to it. It's a journey to a good port, but it does have some difficulties, very peculiar ones actually. The focus has to be placed, or I decided to put it in the young adults in their 20s, when there's constant imbalances that are associated to any transition period and any evolution. We have to take into account that this beginning of the adulthood is determined by certain challenges that these young people have to face. Finishing their studies, their first job, living as a couple, even considering motherhood or fatherhood. And it seems that all these elements required a higher degree of independence at all levels and also higher responsibility. The approach that we use is not based on performance or the potential. We focus ourselves in a comprehensive way. We understand that giftedness takes all the vital steps of the individual. It has an influence and expresses itself in the whole development, from the neurobiological area to the spiritual area too, and with the values. And nobody stops being gifted from one day to another. Nobody stops being gifted because they haven't been identified. This is something that has to be very clear. We tend to promote this idea, some other authors and myself, that giftedness is present 24/7 and all along the year. And it's so complex. It's associated to intensity, emotional intensity. When identifying adults, we're going to have some hurdles. that we are going to share with you. Most gifted adults have never been identified as such, or even having been identified, they might have some struggles including it into their self. They can even not believe it or feel have a distortion of their self-conception. But giftedness is a bit different for those people who study the construct of the human being. Actually, there's no unity in the academic. People who haven't been identified or don't have support, they can feel that their capacities are rejected. When there's also physical limitations or cultural differences or psychological limits or learning difficulties, they might also try to make these gifts invisible. We also put a great interest or great focus in trying to identify and work giftedness for the kids, but we have to understand that adults also have difficulties and also need support. If education gives a priority to products over mental processes, we're creating a set and a scenario in which kids will enter their adulthood denying their capacities. What kids? Well, especially those kids that might not be able to adapt their mental roles to the range of the school performance. And we can end up thinking that they enter adulthood fragmented, unsatisfied, frustrated. In the world of the adults, giftedness seems to be a synonym of high profile, successful. But very often it happens that it seems that people know very little about their unusual minds and how they differ from more common minds. We have quite a bit of information on literacy about the imposter syndrome, and very often this syndrome can prevent them from acting and developing themselves because they take crucial decisions and perceptions about their self-esteem. An interesting obstacle that we also find very often is the way of including giftedness as a neurodiverse condition. There are different wiring in these people. The people with this specific wiring in their brain differs from the norm, but it doesn't mean that they cannot develop themselves. It's part of their human condition, and that's something that we need to normalize. It's also a very diverse population, and we cannot just label them all as the same. There's as much giftedness as gifted people. It's not a simple matter. It happens in different ways, different intensities, different levels. That's why it's so important to approach giftedness as a psychology, exceptionality psychology. Linda Silverman has mentioned that this situation requires different needs, significantly different needs, early determination, early identification, and according approach. Every field of exceptionality have been accepted in psychology, but we need to legitimate this giftedness because we need to approach the internal life of gifted kids. They focus mainly generally in the success of these students, but we need to develop also their emotions. How do we explore the assessment? How do we develop a psychodiagnostic? Well, as a comprehensive assessment, in the first place, we want to see essential qualitative elements even in the adult, or especially in the adult. That sometimes these aspects are self-derived, and the these adults don't want to follow a set of tests, intelligence tests. We need to assess cognitive elements, memory, attention, executive performance, creative elements, social-emotional aspects, overexcitability, psychomotor, imagination, intellectual, emotional senses. It's senses, sensory. Sorry. The health, background, interests, preferences. What is their path they followed in the educational and training institutions? What are the indicators of giftedness in their vital history, personality, habits, needs? Maybe they had an early development of their skills, maybe an early development of morality, early mature questions. If they've clashed with authority figures, we have to be very careful and we have to pay strong attention here. We also need to think, what is the perception about their problem? Why do they have an issue to access to well-being? And to explore other elements depending on the visit. Maybe there's a double exceptionality, or maybe we need to make a differential diagnosis. To sum up, we need a clinical judgment of the therapist. And how are these topics presented, these issues? This is what these steps, these milestones that we find. What are their expectations? And I will read to you and share some expressions. Trying to find an answer to whatever happened to me before. Why am I like this? I see myself different. I want to know myself. I always felt different along my life. I think there's a mistake in the code in which I was designed. When I was little, especially, I had that problem. I couldn't think like the others. I couldn't talk. I was not interested in the same things. And I said, I'm going to make an effort. I always wanted to understand myself. I was always looking for myself from my teenagehood. A different one. I've always felt out of place, different to others. Something was missing, but I couldn't define what. There was like a manufacturing mistake in myself. I was trying to figure out what was going on, what was wrong, trying to find answers and justifying myself constantly. They ended up being satisfactory, but somehow didn't match, didn't fit together. I'm at the end of my university degree. I would like to study something different. I feel an ambiguity. It's a challenge that I will be able to face. Maybe not. Maybe I consider myself smarter than I am. When I was very little, I felt different, far, curious. Certain characteristics of my colleagues caught my attention. I was ill very often. I went to school. My performance was okay. But I felt alone for a long time without being able to share, as if I was speaking a completely different language. Let's see then, which are these recurrent topics that come, those steps, those areas that require a higher personal work. It doesn't pretend to be a very in-depth list. I just want to share with you some of the topics that are very often appear very often. A young man says, at school I always had adaptation problems because of my behavior. I didn't fit in the way the classes were conducted. The teachers used to believe that I was very lazy. Used to speak to some colleague, but I felt that I was speaking another language. The others didn't understand me. They couldn't understand me. Loneliness and misunderstanding. These are elements that people feel. Social isolation, high sensitivity, sensory and emotional and sensory sensitivity. This is something that I question myself. Do I feel more than others? I believe in God. especially when the wind blows. I love the earth. I go barefoot. I touch everything I see, and I want to see what I feel. There's also lack of patience, thoughts, persistent curiosity, divergent thought, multi-potentiality, boredom, empathy, compassion. A young man told me, a young woman told me, I'm not very good at relations, but I'm very good at listening. In the group, I have good empathy. I'm critical. Qualities that make me a positive leader. But on the other hand, altruism and the way of criticism makes me give that authority away. There's also perfectionism, outrage when something is not fair or not moral. It's very upsetting that people lie. It's a lie. It's the cheating. I'm very bad at lying. It generates me very high anxiety. They also present deep worries, somatic unconfident, anxiety, intense fear. They have difficulties when connecting to the parents, couples, friendship, brothers and sisters, teachers. That's why I think it's very important to have a systemic approach. And if you want, maybe we can agree vindicated interviews so we can also get information what it means to be gifted for the family. And it actually helps very much to accept their own gift. Because if the environment, if their family supports them, it's easier to walk this path. In words of a younger, fear devours me. Where is my value? Where is my braveness? I disappear. It just took over. Fear absorbs me, eliminates me. It's a deep fear that blocks me. There are also difficulties when setting limits, maybe in the academic environment, anxiety when exams come, difficulties to decode even some of the signals they receive, and difficulties when sleeping, especially in these pandemic times that we've been living. Something that I often mention to these kids, and I do so to you when listening, we need to start thinking how those features interact in your life. Are they hindering or promoting or helping your goals, your development? Especially when we go further exploring all these elements. There's some concepts that I'd like to share. Some therapeutic, specialized therapists have connected identity, the gifted identity. Second childhood from Harvey's son, Jennifer. The first childhood, the biological one, and their development stages, such as developing the hope, autonomy, purpose, self-confidence, are followed in a time and in a context in which they didn't have all the information, crucial information. They didn't know they were gifted. Therefore, the identity development is often done in a non-authentic way, as if without it being their fault. It's a distorted development, and for many adults, what happens, learning about their giftedness takes them back to a second childhood, where they develop ways or tasks that they couldn't do as children. It's very important then where to identify where the development can have been blocked. Where do they have to focus their efforts to validate and to create the conditions to follow these development steps? They also have to take into account that trauma, abuse, negligence will also have a different impact and will require different type of interventions, not just talking about than we would do talking about other less damaging circumstances. Gross describes a conflict that forced choice dilemma, where they have two normally complementary impulses that are intimacy and performance, but with gifted people, there's a dilemma. And sometimes to solve it, they just give a step back and they hide behind a mask. There's a conflict between a personality and identity and the need of being accepted by their equals, by their peers. So if one knows they can perform well and satisfy their excellence feeling, they might need to sacrifice their intimacy with their peers who might feel resentful for this capacity, this exceptional capacity. But on the other hand, if the primary need is to find that intimacy, they're going to moderate their performance. They can actually even hide their intellectual interest and just accept a set of values that might not be perfect for their personal value. Especially girls are really good at hiding. Self-acceptance is an essential part of it when building your identity, especially when developing solid personal relations. Another author, very interesting author to work with, is Mahoney Andrew. He presents to us a complex model and very interesting. He says that identity is complex, multifaceted, and is in constant evolution. He presents to us 4 constructs: validation, affirmation, affiliation, and affinity, through all these systems, these 12 systems. These first 4 constructs or principles that shape and have an influence on identity are validation in first place, both from ourselves and from others. And it's to admit giftedness. This is very important. The primary connections and primary ties, teachers, parents, have an impact on this validation. Affirmation is to gain and to perceive the nuances of giftedness. Affiliation is to connect with others with similar interests, passions, overacceptabilities, being able to be accepted and to be welcomed in a group without losing their identity and without feeling so different. For adults, this is usually difficult to find associations, support groups. But it's not impossible now that with the networks, especially with the pandemics, the networks have grown enormously, and we can contact much easier with on the virtual sphere. Affinity is to develop a vocational purpose or purpose to connect to the world. Is somehow, what are we attracted to? What nurtures us? What it resembles? What are approaches of the souls? A young person might have a passion to work in a collective for a social cause. These are all the variables that are also complex that go through these 4 constructs. And I'm going to go very briefly. A system of self has to do with values and beliefs, includes the internal vision of oneself and how others see us. Family system is very connected, very immediate. Partner, kids, parents. Origin family system. What beliefs, what traditions they come from our background, from our history? Culture is also important because here comes all the prejudices and the pressure they place on us, the stereotypes about giftedness. Vocational system are there multipotentiality? How is the development of the career, education, future education and performance? Environmental systems, geography, the structure of the home. Are we promoting creativity of this gifted young person? The educational system with the formal and informal institutions? Are they supporting gifted people? The social system, peers, friends, do they allow this young person to develop in a healthy way? Does he have a support group? Psychological system, how this gifted person is building up their concept and their self-esteem. The political system, and here's where they involve in a very proactive way to give more visibility to their collective. We have maybe they're working on including the giftedness in the political sphere, political agenda. The organic and physiological. Well, giftedness has a connection with biology. And very often the fact that the kid knows or the young person understands this connection gives a good answer to them about themselves. They have an explanation to their features. And finally, the development system. Another concept that I want to share with you is from these works done, from a work done by these authors in the University of Duisburg, Essen, in Germany. From the development of the gifted identity, they created a model that is a gas model. I will explain to you very briefly. And then they say that the creation of the identity is especially challenging for the stigmatized minorities. Minorities face particular challenges when building their own identity. And of course, having some resources to face these challenges helps them prevent certain factors. And here it's very important to have the support from other members. When the identity of the majority is considered the norm model and anything else is a deviation, it's when the psychosocial stress may appear. Prejudices and discriminations that are focused on the minorities, they can develop into psychosocial distress. Individual vulnerability and the mechanisms to face have an influence the degree of experience of the stress of the minority individuals. The findings in the investigation suggest that gifted people can also experiment stressful factors, especially due to the minority feature. And it can lead to stigmatization feelings, and it can actually prevent and hinder their identity, the development of their identity. I also mentioned the CAS model for the identity development, and I want to present it here, especially regarding the steps and the phases that they present. First, there's a confusion, noticing that one could be part of a minority. Then comparison, feeling different, feeling alienated. Tolerance, accepting a growing acceptance of the minority condition of minority, while keeping an identity of public majority. And rarely do they reveal this minority identity to some of these members of the majority. Acceptance means a growing acceptance of the minority condition, but still keeping somehow a majority appearance when they consider it necessary. Towards the end, pride, where the minority is extremely valued and majority is not so much perceived. And then we go to the integration where there's a congruence, a harmonic congruence between feelings and behaviors of the individual and their minority identity. Here's where it flows. It seems to flow. They're flowing in the majority with a connection, a two-way connection. We need to give a safe place to these young adults so they can feel comfortable enough, confident to show their real self. If we summarize then, the construction of a safe place is going to be crossed by different variables. They're going to have an influence in the development of the person, a political, social-political context, social-cultural context, family, the school, the health system, and the conception, the perception of giftedness. And why do we have to identify giftedness? Well, there's quite a few good reasons for this. Well, to face the vision, distorted vision of ours, of the self, not trying to be the one you are not, it has a very high emotional price. To know what a gifted person does and how to manage their features for personal growth and personal efficacy, to normalize neurodiversity, giftedness is part of the human condition. And going back to this personal efficiency and personal growth, it's important to let them know that being intelligent doesn't necessarily mean that we can be very efficient, because cognitive efficiency has nothing to do, well, has other variables that don't have to do with intelligence. Self-knowledge, understanding our own patterns, beliefs, behaviors, effective, loving life, is going to place us in a better condition for a future mother or fatherhood. To make self-performance easier, to feel, to find a better social, emotional, and spiritual well-being, to give an answer, appropriate and adjusted psychotherapeutical response, and to understand the identification needs and characteristics that follow in the personality, habits, and needs. It's not just an IQ figure, which is important because it sets a synchronic information on the intensity and the complexity of the individual, but there's much more to it. We need to take into account all the qualitative features and not just the quantitative ones. Sometimes running away from a exceptional capacity is perfectly understandable because they feel that that idea is non-compatible with their self-perception. Some others might resist because they might not be able to reach the expectations of the labels they've already been placed, they've already received. And there are some people whose identity is connected to shame, and they struggle to call themselves a gifted person. But if we manage to identify and to assimilate not just a high intelligence element, but there is a profile personality associated to giftedness, that resistance seems to weaken. There are better words, more empathic words that's gifted, such as zebra, tropical zebra mind. We also have to take into account that some adults could present psychological disorders, psychiatric disorders in some cases, but we have to be very careful not to misinterpret the features that are connected to giftedness with a disorder. Of course, there are double exceptionality, that also gifted person with a personality disorder, with Asperger, with anxiety, with executive disorder, but we have to be very careful when assessing these elements, because we could not be seeing all of them, and they could be features that are exclusively associated to giftedness. I'd like to share some of the features that are often misdiagnosed as other disorders that were compiled by all these professionals in the health mental area. High activity level, impulsivity, excessive worry, sensitivities to strong sounds, to textures in clothes, great emotionality, denied to do school tasks, not stubborn, not being able to comply with daily tasks, difficulties with transitions, impatient, interrupting, arguing, frequent change moods, being absent-minded, having difficulties to read or write, bad writing, not paying attention, sleeping very little, picky eater, having a peculiar sense of humor, or having delays in speaking or language. There's many, and I'm not trying to give you a recipe, a magic formula to give you an in-depth list. I'm trying to show and share with you some of the most remarkable ones. And what happens when we cannot identify and satisfy the needs of the young adult population, gifted population? Well, there can be anxiety, depression, low academic performance, giving up their studies, isolation, social isolation, poor identity, unhealthy habits, non-desired behaviors, self-harming features, feeling that their features are disorders, dysfunctions with relations, and even committing suicide. This is something that really gives us a strong reason to get involved in the mental health of gifted young adults. And I'd like to share with you some conclusions. The development of identity starts in the early childhood and continues along their life. Formulation of the identity gets more complex due to the factors derived from the difference from the rest with whom they need to relate. Gifted people tend to hide their talents, not because they have a problem with them, but because the environment where they live and work and are not going to help them develop these talents. So there has to be a redefinition process in their adulthood, especially for those who have been hiding their capacities and their interests behind a mask for protection. Otherwise, they might lose contact, might lose touch with their feelings and beliefs. This redefinition process, but according to Gross, can be a healing experience. So the process to identification in the adultness, the young adultness, it's an opportunity to re-signify our own vital history. What type of therapists do we need? Well, Jacobson works very much with gifted adults, presents us some items. So for the patient to experiment a successful communion with herself, the therapist must acquire the necessary skills to have a positive consideration, to give them support to their creativity and individuality of the patient. There has to be an art of how to plant the seeds, to suggest and then let them work with it, with their self-analysis of the patient. The competent counselor will be aware of the resources for gifted people and will be ready to share suggestions that could increase self-understanding and self-efficacy and will lead the patient towards connections to other real colleagues. It doesn't have to be, these people don't need to have to be other gifted people. They can be just people who share some of the areas, some of the interests, some of the common expectations. That's also important. Because in the short term, you don't always find other gifted colleagues. Following the expressions of the patient with high interest, with enthusiasm, intention, even if the topic is abstract or not presented that clearly. We have to think and remember about these divergent thoughts of the kids. Occasionally and very respectfully, you can also include humor and curiosity that are aligned with the questions of the patient. Avoid just too much listening and lack of activeness and routine answers. We should be an understanding collaborator that is sophisticated in the ways for the psychological development without being a competitor or without being someone who has all the answers. We have to be transparent. We're showing a real preference for a topic. Otherwise, the connection will be damaged. Explore and then debate from different points of view and different levels of significancy and meaning. The therapist also has to have a great deal of solid and clinically valid interventions. We also have abstract, operational. These make operational the abstract ideas that the patient can bring. Work with the patient, negotiating the direction, the pace, and the approach of the treatment, and setting clear limits. The author says the gifted adult can wake the sleeping giant when it can develop itself without restrictions. And to finish this presentation, I'd like to share with you something that published from Michael Mahoney about a new narrative. He's a constructive therapist that mentions that the reinterpretations that we make and that are mostly efficient share these characteristics that we're going to mention. First, variation in the focus of attention, in the different explanations that they give to whatever happens when we're identifying progress and in the therapeutic process, if it happens. Variations in their relation with guilt, reducing the need to find guilty elements and increasing acceptance and forgiveness, not only to themselves but to their environment, parents, colleagues, teachers. Increasing the complexity of the person itself and of their argument about their own history. I think that the human being doesn't only have a carrier, they're not only a carrier of a story, they're also a creator and they're also a product of it. They are trying to help. The therapist should also help the young adult to create that meaning, to create that story of life. Another characteristic that Mr. Mahoney shares is a change in the emphasis from the past to the present and then to future possibility, and of course a change towards a more positive interpretation of the self. We're coming to the end of this presentation, and I'd like to share a poem also by Michael Mahoney for all those people who are experimenting or who are deep into the mystery of change. The pilgrim in process. It's a moment for transition, and again you're progressing in a path towards somewhere you cannot deny, looking for yourself in the labyrinth of your heart and feeling that you're not alone. Yes, it seems that you're still changing for good or for bad, and you dream with those holy places that you still have to find, and you feel your wishes with a curse or with a blessing. You feel unbalanced, you've got pressures in your mind. You want to let your fears and agonies go. You're trying to see the light, but there's still there a fear that hinders your freedom while you're fighting in the limits of the night. Your reason is rejecting what they wish, begging you to find what you need. But then something comes with strength from your inside to go further away from your patterns. And then a window opens and you can see how the whole structure of yourself is waiting. You want to shout of rage and cry of happiness, and you're worried that it might be too late. The roller coaster falls at a high speed. You grab the truths that are still there. You never completely understand that you need to feel safe. That's what keeps you in this path. You survive to this pendulum, and you start to understand their role. And you wonder while your balance seems to become more familiar and the destiny of your life is felt there. So carefully and admiring it with questions and searches, you follow the path that is your path. You know you've reached the line of your internal life, and that deeper travels cannot be far away. Of course, there will be moments in which an older vision will come with strength and you will question whether you can change. And still, deep inside, you feel that there are things to come. And the old vision is what now seems to be strange. Take care, my friend. Listen to the
Cuídate,
murmur of your
amigo,
heart
y escucha el
while it's
murmullo de tu
beating.
corazón. Mientras late el
Within your
preciado ritmo
day-to-day,
de
my
tus
warm
días,
thoughts
mis
are with
cálidos
you in
pensamientos
your
y mis
path
esperanzas
along
están
everything.
contigo en tus
The
viajes
path
por
in
todo.
life
Y las
finds
sendas de
its
la
way.
vida en proceso encuentran sus
Have a
caminos. Ten
kind
una existencia
approach.
amable, peregrino en
Learn to
proceso.
trust.
Aprende a
Trust is
confiar,
valuable,
que la
and the same
confianza
happens
es
with
valiosa.
laughter
Lo
and
mismo
rest.
ocurre con la risa y el
Remember that
descanso.
living is
Recuerda
love
que
in
vivir es
itself,
un
and the
amor en sí
secret
mismo
is
y
to
el
stay
secreto
always in
es
the search,
permanecer
especially
siempre en la
dedicated to
búsqueda.
those young adults
Especialmente
that
dedicado a
nurtured
todos los
my
jóvenes
experience,
que
my professional
nutrieron
experience,
mi
and that they
experiencia
enriched
profesional y
today's
que
session.
enriquecieron el
Thank you
encuentro
very
de hoy.
much. Very warm
Un abrazo
hug,
fraterno para
and I
todos
hope
y hasta la
we will
próxima
soon be
oportunidad
able
en que
to share
podamos
this
compartir un
space.
nuevo
Thank you.
espacio.